B.3.1. What is the difference between private property and possession? Anarchists define private property, or just property for short, as state-protected monopolies of certain objects or privileges which are used to control and exploit others. Possession, on the other hand, is ownership of things that are not used to exploit others, for example, a car, a refrigerator, a toothbrush, etc. Thus, many things can be considered as either property or possessions depending on how they are used. To summarize, anarchists are in favor of the kind of property which, open quote, cannot be used to exploit another, those kinds of personal possessions which we accumulate from childhood and which become part of our lives, end quote. We are opposed to the kind of property, open quote, which can be used only to exploit people, land and buildings, instruments of production and distribution, raw materials and manufactured articles, money, and capital, end quote. As a rule of thumb, anarchists oppose those forms of property which are owned by a few people, but which are used by others. This leads to the former controlling the latter and using them to produce a surplus for them, either directly, as in the case of an employee, or indirectly in the case of a tenant. The key is that possession is rooted in the concept of use rights or usufruct, while private property is rooted in a divorce between the users and ownership. For example, a house that one lives in is a possession, whereas if one rents it to someone else at a profit, it becomes property. Similarly, if one uses a saw to make a living as a self-employed carpenter, the saw is a possession. Whereas if one employs others at wages to use the saw for one's own profit, it is property. Needless to say, a capitalist workplace where the workers are ordered about by a boss is an example of property, while a cooperative where the workers manage their own work is an example of possession. To quote Proudhon, open quote, the proprietor is a man who, having absolute control of an instrument of production, claims the right to enjoy the product of the instrument without using it himself. To this end, he lends it, end quote. While it may initially be confusing to make this distinction, it is very useful to understand the nature of capitalist society. Capitalists tend to use the word property to mean anything from a toothbrush to a transnational corporation, two very different things with very different impacts upon society. Hence Proudhon, open quote, originally the word property was synonymous with proper or individual possession. It designated each individual's special right to the use of a thing. But when this right of use became active and paramount, that is, when the usufructuary converted his right to personally use the thing into the right to use it by his neighbor's labor, then property changed its nature and this idea became complex, end quote. Proudhon graphically illustrated the distinction by comparing a lover as a possessor and a husband as a proprietor. As he stressed, the, open quote, double definition of property, domain, and possession is of highest importance and must be clearly understood in order to comprehend, end quote, what anarchism is really about. So while some may question why we make this distinction, the reason is clear. As Proudhon argued, open quote, it is proper to call different things by different names. If we keep the name property for the former possession, we must call the latter, the domain of property, robbery, rapine, brigandage. If, on the contrary, we reserve the name property for the latter, we must designate the former by the term possession or some other equivalent. Otherwise, we should be troubled with an unpleasant synonym, end quote. The difference between property and possession can be seen from the types of authority relations each generates. Taking the example of a capitalist workplace, it's clear that those who own the workplace determine how it is used, not those who do the actual work. This leads to an almost totalitarian system. As Noam Chomsky points out, open quote, the term totalitarian is quite accurate. There is no human institution that approaches totalitarianism as closely as a business corporation. I mean, power is completely top-down. You can be inside it somewhere and you take orders from above and hand them down. Ultimately, it's in the hands of owners and investors." End quote. Thus, the actual producer does not control their own activity, the product of their labor, nor the means of production they use. In modern class societies, the producer is in a position of subordination to those who actually do own or manage the productive process. In an anarchist society, as noted, actual use is considered the only title. This means that a workplace is organized and run by those who work within it, thus reducing hierarchy and increasing freedom and equality within society. Hence, anarchist opposition to private property and capitalism flows naturally from anarchism's basic principles and ideas. Hence, all anarchists agree with Proudhon, open quote, "Possession is a right. Property is against right. Suppress property while maintaining possession." End quote. As Alexander Berkman frames this distinction, anarchism, open quote, abolishes private ownership of the means of production and distribution, and with it goes capitalist business. Personal possession remains only in the things you use. Thus, your watch is your own, but the watch factory belongs to the people. Land, machinery, and all other public utilities will be collective property, neither to be bought nor sold. Actual use will be considered the only title, not to ownership, but to possession. End quote. This analysis of different forms of property is at the heart of both social and individualist anarchism. This means that all anarchists seek to change people's opinions on what is to be considered as valid forms of property, aiming to see that, open quote, the anarchistic view that occupancy and use should condition and limit landholding becomes the prevailing view, and so ensure that individuals should no longer be protected by their fellows in anything but personal occupation and cultivation, i.e. use, of land. End quote. The key differences, as we noted in section 8.3.1, is how they apply this principle. This anarchist support for possession does not imply the breakup of large-scale organizations such as factories or other workplaces which require large numbers of people to operate. Far from it. Anarchists argue for association as the complement of possession. This means applying occupancy and use to property which is worked by more than one person, resulting in associated labor, i.e. those who collectively work together, i.e. use a given property, manage it, and their own labor as a self-governing, directly democratic association of equals, usually called self-management for short. This logically flows from the theory of possession, of occupancy and use. For if production is carried on in groups, who is the legal occupier of the land? The employer or their manager? Obviously not, as they are by definition occupying more than they can use by themselves. Clearly, the association of those engaged in the work can be the only rational answer. Hence Proudhon's comment that, open quote, all accumulated capital being social property, no one can be its exclusive proprietor. In order to destroy despotism and inequality of conditions, men must become associates. And this implies workers' self-management. Leaders, instructors, superintendents must be chosen from the laborers by the laborers themselves. End quote. In this way, anarchists seek, in Proudhon's words, open quote, abolition of the proletariat, end quote, and consider a key idea of our ideas that, open quote, industrial democracy must succeed industrial feudalism, end quote. Thus, an anarchist society would be based on possession, with workers' self-management being practiced at all levels, from the smallest one-person workplace or farm to large-scale industry. See section I.3 for more discussion. Clearly then, all anarchists seek to transform and limit property rights. Capitalist property rights would be ended and a new system introduced, rooted in the concept of possession and use. While the exact nature of that new system differs between schools of anarchist thought, the basic principles are the same as they flow from the same anarchist theory of property to be found in Proudhon's What is Property? Significantly, William Godwin, in his Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, makes the same point concerning the difference between property and possession, although not in the same language, 50 years before Proudhon, which indicates its central place in anarchist thought. For Godwin, there were different kinds of property. One kind was, open quote, the empire to which every person is entitled over the produce of his or her own industry, end quote. However, another kind was, open quote, a system in whatever manner established by which one man enters into the faculty of disposing of the produce of another man's industry, end quote. This, open quote, species of property is in direct contradiction, end quote, to the former kind. The similarities with subsequent anarchist ideas is striking. For Godwin, inequality produces a servile spirit in the poor and, moreover, a person who, open quote, is born to poverty may be said, under another name, to be born a slave, end quote. Needless to say, anarchists have not been totally consistent in using this terminology. Some, for example, have referred to the capitalist and landlord classes as being the possessing classes. Others prefer to use the term personal property rather than possession, or capital rather than private property. Some, like many individualist anarchists, use the term property in a general sense and qualify it with occupancy and use in the case of land, housing, and workplaces. However, no matter the specific words used, the key idea is the same.